Susan Jacoby is one of the best known and one of the leading humanists in America today, and has been for 20 or 30 years. She is the author of 12 books. I will mention only the 4 that I own, which is Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism, The Age of American Unreason, a biography of Robert Ingersoll called The Great Agnostic, which was what he was called in his own day, and the book which is the subject of her talk today, which Donna and I bought just a few months ago, and I'm enjoying thoroughly. Strange Gods, a secular history of conversion. Susan Jacoby. Yeah.
I'm not exactly talking about my book, Strange Gods. This talk was originally titled "Sick and Tired of God Bless America," but it's been a bit adapted. Okay, so earlier this year I wrote an op-ed piece for the Times that appeared under the headline "Sick and Tired of God Bless America." It was their headline, not mine, but I liked it in a way I don't usually like all of the headlines editors put on my articles. In this piece, I was discussing the implications of a poll by the Pew Research Center, and I'm sure that most of you in this room are probably familiar with that poll, which indicates that the number of Americans who don't belong to any religious group, and even more important, who say that religion is not particularly important in their daily lives, has risen from 21 million in 2008 to more than 36 million in this election year. This is really a lot of people, and an extraordinary increase within a very short period of time as historical time is measured. But the shift toward a more secular American population hasn't been reflected in our politics. No candidate thinks that he or she has anything to lose by offending us. I thought, given the prospect of this miserable presidential campaign coming to an end, that this would be a good time to talk about what we as secular humanists can do to become more influential in the public square. Now, inveighing against the perfidy of the religious right won't do it. We have to become more aggressive and more effective at bringing the message to the American public that secular values are American values, and not letting either the religious right or the religious left get away with what they've gotten away with for the past 30 years. The claim that religious is implicit in the phrase American values, and that the only dispute is over what kind of religion is defining the values. Now, in some ways, this presidential campaign doesn't illustrate my point as clearly as other campaigns in the recent past have, because I think this election year has been so dominated by the crazed outside personality of Donald Trump and the stated antipathy of many voters toward both Trump and Hillary Clinton. Kowtowing to religion hasn't been as much a part of the day-to-day as it usually is. Now, that being non-religious is no guarantee of virtue is well demonstrated by the fact that Trump is probably the least religious candidate to be nominated for the presidency since Thomas Jefferson. No question about it. Now, that's undoubtedly why Le Grand Orange, that's what my hair colorist calls him, picked Mike Pence, who is as far to the Looney Tunes religious right as you can get in this country, as his running mate. One of the more comical episodes in the aftermath of the videotape of Trump's locker room talk was Pence's justification for remaining on the ticket. Quote, "There's only been one perfect person in the history of the world," Pence said. "Everyone else requires grace and forgiveness." Now, one of my greatest disappointments in relation to my new book, Strange Gods, available on Amazon in hardcover and ebook, one of my greatest disappointments is that Pence's strange religious history, as a convert from traditional Roman Catholicism to right-wing evangelical Protestantism, was something I didn't know until, of course, long after the book was set and typed. Pence's mother is still so mad about this that she wouldn't talk to the Times for an article about her son's religious odyssey. In fact, Trump's in spite of his 3 wives and contentious divorces, no one should be fooled about what a Trump administration would mean for the separation of church and state. I don't know, need to tell you his list of potential nominees for the Supreme Court is straight out of the religious right playbook. And I think even more important, he's learned to appropriate the language of religious liberty, which actually means that the conduct of public institutions should be determined by the most conservative faiths in the nation. And again, there's the choice of Pence as Trump's running age. That Pence is the man who would become our next president if a putative President Trump didn't turn out to be as hugely, amazingly, gloriously top of the line healthy as he thinks he is. Pence's record as governor of Indiana as an intense opponent of both women's reproductive rights and gay rights speaks for itself. And again, almost no attention has been focused on Pence's attempts to eviscerate the separation of church and state during this cockamamie campaign. Now, Clinton and her running mate Tim Kaine are both religious too, but theirs is the sort of religion that normally translates into support for the separation of church and state. Clinton is a serious Methodist, and Kaine is a very devout Catholic who is, like many lay American Catholics, strongly pro-choice and gay rights. Clinton and Kaine also speak out strongly against the science deniers, almost all of whom are located at the extreme end of the religious conservative spectrum. So, what we have is an authentically religious presidential candidate who takes largely secular religions on public affairs, and a man who doesn't even know how to pronounce the names of the book of the Bible, climbing into bed with the far, far religious right. As citizens, one choice those of us in this room certainly don't have is basing whatever activism we continue on the premise that within the foreseeable future there are going to be a lot of avowedly atheist or secular humanist candidates for high office who articulate proud, in-your-face secular humanist values. At this stage of the development of the secular movement, articulating those values and articulating them forcefully really has got to be the job of people like us. The question is how to do it in a way that reaches out, particularly to people under 30. How it reaches out to the growing portions of Americans who say already that religion does not determine their daily lives. Now, as I see the problem, it's that a lot of young people are still brainwashed enough by the public culture of religion that they're afraid to openly call themselves either atheists or secular humanists or agnostics, and instead fall back on that I'm spiritual but not religious. We may be sick and tired of God Bless America, but we're not going to have a president anytime soon who replaces it with something else. My choice would be, of course, this land is your land. But, you know, I'd even settle for when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's amore. Look, we're not even going, I'm also working on a new book on baseball. We're not even going to have a baseball commissioner who stops the odious practice, prevalent in many ballparks since 9/11, of replacing Take Me Out to the Ball Game with God Bless America during the 7th inning stretch. You know, when I was a little kid until I was about 7, I thought that Take Me Out to the Ball Game was the national anthem. I really did. I was about 7 when it was explained to me that it wasn't. So, at this point, all of us are in the ironic and sometimes uncomfortable position of always being asked to choose between religious candidates who support the separation of church and state, as many do, and religious candidates who want to trash it. So this has rendered us relatively impotent politically because, let's face it, no matter how often Democratic candidates ignore the role that the secular vote plays in the Democratic coalition, they take our votes for granted. And it's understandable that they do. What atheist or agnostic or humanist or whatever we call ourselves is going to vote for a Republican as long as there's a Supreme Court, even though the Republicans have refused to let President Obama appoint any Supreme Court justice in his last year of office. Sitting on our hands and saying a pox on both your houses is just, in my view, it's simply not an option for secular humanists. And I should say, I delivered this particular line last weekend at the Freedom from Religion Foundation convention. Wonderful people, but there were a lot of libertarians there who were voting for, you know who, yes, who had just that day said that because he didn't know anything about the world, he was a lot likely to get us into a war. And anyway, I got a lot of blowback, so I'm just going to apologize in advance to anyone who's voting for a third party. You're wrong. Okay. So I think the real question is what we ourselves can do to bridge the gap between the stigma that's still attached to ungodliness and the reality that the ungodly are now a much larger minority than many religious denominations. First, I'd like to talk about two tactics that don't, in my opinion, work. I'm not crazy about the slogan, good without God. And once we get through Halloween and the election, whichever turns out to be spookier, the annual onslaught of Christmas will bring about a revival of this well-meant, but I think badly thought-out attempt to convince our religious neighbors that we're just as good, or at least no worse than those who believe in a deity. To me, there's something unseemly and self-abasing about basically saying to the world, I am not who other people say I am. Now, Philip Roth made a similar observation about Jews when he was attacked by many influential American Jewish organizations early in his career for writing stories with Jewish characters who were not exactly models of restraint and rectitude. You can't construct a public identity out of constantly saying, no, I don't fit stupid stereotypes. I was once asked by the conservative talk show host Michael Medved, who happens to be an Orthodox Jew, what's to stop you from committing murder if you don't believe in God? Now, that was in 2004. I've been asked this question many times since, but that was the first time. So I really didn't know what to say, and I just sort of muttered, well, committing murder really not something that's really occurred to me very often, which was true. What I should have said, and it's just wonderful when you remember what you should have said, after you no longer have the opportunity. I should have said, but I wasn't quick-witted enough to come up with it on the spot, was what's to stop you from committing murder if your God orders it? He's done it in the past. In fact, he did it at the founding of your religion. And of course, the answer is that Abraham would have gone ahead and murdered Isaac if God, that prankster, hadn't recanted the last minute and said, just joking, just wanted to see if you'd really obey me. The story of Abraham is reason enough for my reservations about the good without God campaign. I don't know about you, but my beliefs have never told me that I have to kill a child in order to please some universal power. Second, I also think we ought to choose our symbolic battles very carefully. I don't mean to suggest that symbols are unimportant, but that when we do go after them, they should be symbols that clearly violate the Constitution. Getting 10 Commandments out of courthouses is important because those monuments support and perpetuate the myth that our laws are based on prohibitions in the Bible. In fact, we're talking about the 10 Commandments, many of which are not crimes, but are in religious terms sins. We don't try people for adultery anymore. We don't use spectral evidence at trials anymore. We don't try anyone for coveting his neighbor's wife or his ox or his ass, or for not honoring her father or mother, unless she's committing elder abuse, in which case we try her for assault. So the 10 Commandments monuments have no place in courthouses, and I support all lawsuits by all organizations that are aimed at getting rid of so-called symbols that are used in a way that violates the Constitution. But engaging in symbolic battles that can only be seen by the religious minority as taking away something precious for reasons that have little or nothing to do with the Constitution, I think creates tremendous backlash and accomplishes nothing. We did, in my view, again, and you could come after me in the Q&A, we had a classic example in New York a few years ago when the American Atheist attempted to bar the placement at the 9/11 Memorial Museum of that cross created by the two steel beams that crashed and melted and welded to each other in the form of a crucifix. Now, first of all, this cross was to be and is displayed among thousands of other artifacts from those times. was part of the history of the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks. And its presence amid that rubble was meaningful to many restaurant workers. It wasn't as if that cross were being given pride of place. It was simply going to be one of thousands of exhibits. And so the atheist lawsuit predictably went nowhere in federal court, and it shouldn't have. You and I may think that finding meaning in two beams that accidentally became welded together is ridiculous. But the fact is that that cross did mean something to people who, unlike most of us, were actually pulling human remains out of the ground. What the whole episode of the lawsuit did was reinforce the image of atheists as an intolerant minority. Sure, there would have been a constitutional issue if that cross were on top of the museum. And I heard people say that they, as atheists, were offended by the very presence of this artifact in the museum. Well, all I can say is they must be pretty thin-skinned to be offended by that. I mean, if there had been a statue of Prometheus at Ground Zero and it had been deliberately left out of the museum because someone considered it too secular, that'd be a symbolic case I'd support. So, one reason I think it's important to pick those battles carefully is that if we're all over the place, it dilutes our voice when it needs to be used. Several years ago, I wrote another New York Times op-ed after the Newtown school shootings, when President Obama went to an interfaith memorial and talked about Jesus watching over the grieving. The fact is that a number of the victims were Jews and Hindus, and we don't know, but we can assume if the Newtown population is anything like the American population as a whole, that others were raised in secular homes. Now, this would have been a perfect place for the President of the United States to acknowledge that violence violates decent secular as well as decent religious values, and that grief, mourning, and consolation are not limited to people who believe in a supernatural being who guides the world. So, leaving aside these dubious tactics, I think there are several steps that we can and must take, and some of them are already underway in a lot of organizations, to gain the political clout, or more of it, than we already have. First, we do need to concentrate on the young. I can tell you from my talks on campuses throughout the country that the secular movement has the same problem with young people that traditional political parties have. Thank you. The young are, in fact, much less religious than previous generations. But I can't tell you how many college students have told me that they don't want to be, quote, labeled atheists. One of them said, and I quote, "It stands for kind of nerdiness," a student at the University of Minnesota told me. "The people who take part in campus Freethought activities are, well, just a little obsessed," unquote. I've heard college-age women, by the way, say exactly the same thing about their reluctance to be labeled feminists, and I think that's part of Hillary Clinton's problems with women this age. Of course they want equal pay for equal work, the young say, the right to contraception and to choose abortion. But they're also affected, these young women, by the stereotype of the feminist as someone who doesn't like men and who's too serious and, again, nerdy to be attracted to the opposite sex. Quote, "You're the first feminist atheist I've ever met," a student at Augustana College, which is a historically Lutheran college in Rock Island, Illinois, once said to me. "Wow," she said, "it's great you wear lipstick and look like feminine. And it's obvious you don't hate religion." Well, actually, by the way, I've solved the transgender bathroom problem. When there was a woman in the ladies' room up here and there was no man in the men's room, I used the men's room. No problem. Well, anyway, actually, I did tell this young woman at Augustana that there are some religions I do hate, the ones that try to impose their values on me. "Okay," she said, "you don't hate all religion." I think that just showing up as our normal everyday selves on college campuses or anywhere where there are young people is extremely important. No, we don't have horns and tails. Yes, we do have jobs and kids and partners and lovers and all of the concerns in our lives that the religious majority has. I don't participate in debates about the existence of God because, of course, I agree with Robert Ingersoll at Every Science about the impossibility of proving a negative. It's quite enough to say, based on all of the evidence before me, I see no reason to conclude that there is a God. But like all scientific theorems, this conclusion has to remain theoretically open to new evidence. If I go home tonight after getting my friends settled at the hospital, and I find all of the people I love whom I've lost in the last years waiting for me outside my apartment and sitting down to eat spaghetti carbonara, I'll have to rethink what I think about the non-existence of God. But barring that, no. There are, however, and I've found this particularly true at historically religious colleges, all kinds of productive discussions you have with young people that don't talk arguing about the existence of God, but with young people who are just beginning to question the assumptions on which they're raised. I particularly remember one conversation with a young man who was a first-year student at Augustana. He'd come there planning to become a Lutheran minister, but he'd already decided he wanted to become a high school history teacher instead. He'd been raised in a very conservative Lutheran home with fundamentalist beliefs, but Augustana had exposed him to a much more, liberal view in their comparative religion courses of Lutheranism. So this young man said, in my mind, I know you're right when you talk about equality of belief and non-belief in a democracy. But he said, I know. He said, I know that I'm in possession of the truth, and how can I not want the same thing for others? Well, this is actually a reasonable question if you come from that worldview. And I felt sorry for him, because I sensed that this question or this statement was really a result of his beginning to question the kind of faith in which he was raised. And so what I said to him is I reminded him of the famous line in the gospel in which Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? And I talked about how nothing in a secular democracy denies him the right to proselytize anywhere outside public institutions, but it does deny him the right to teach a history class someday in which he tells his students that the Bible is literally historically true. Everywhere I speak, I find at least one person, and sometimes many more, who does want to engage in serious discourse about these subjects. And some of them have actually never met an atheist, or at least someone they knew was an atheist before. The second vastly important area of secular action, which involves people too young to represent themselves, has to do with everything about schools. The work that the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Center for Inquiry have done in battling the use of school assemblies to allow outside religious figures to promote their own after-school religious activities in the guise of anti-bullying or anti-drug messages, usually, is exemplary. In some states, like Pence's Indiana, by the way, that's meant going to court. In others, like Wisconsin, just writing letters to craven school administrators can get results. The infiltration of these right-wing Christian-themed programs into schools is particularly troubling because the population targeted is often teenagers who are already at risk, sometimes because of drug problems or academic issues or other issues surrounding sexuality, often all three. To open kids like this in school to people who are telling that their problems can be solved by religious conversion is not only unconstitutional, but it's medically dangerous. But of course, the biggest education problem, concentrated in the South and various parts of the Midwest, but also surfacing in every state in the nation, various schools, districts, involves the teaching of evolution. And this can be a tough one because it does mean that secular parents have to come out and make trouble. I mean coming out exactly in the sense that it's used by gays as well. Because this can create trouble for one's children and grandchildren. And this can only be accomplished at the local level. Because all national organizations can really do is provide some financial and legal support. Look what happened in Dover, Pennsylvania, when parents, both religious and non-religious, successfully fought against a law that mandated the teaching of intelligent design. This battle ended in 2006-5, actually, with a blistering federal court ruling against the teaching of intelligent design in public schools, one which the higher courts declined to review, so is now a precedent. I don't think it's possible to overestimate the importance of these kinds of values on behalf of science, and of joining with liberal religious allies who also have somehow managed to reconcile their beliefs with science. I mention history because while we hear a lot about evolution, the right-wing attack on the teaching of the secular side of both American and world history is unremitting. Texas is the most extreme example, with regular reviews of textbooks having resulted in such gems as replacing Thomas Jefferson with Thomas Aquinas as important figures in the history of revolutionary thought. Can you imagine what right-wing Christian parents would do if a teacher said something as mild as, "Some scholars don't think Jesus was a historical figure"? Well, frankly, there are places where parents coming out and battling don't work, but there are plenty of other places like Dover where it does work. One thing to be well remembered is that school administrators don't like trouble from anyone. If you raise an issue, sometimes school principals and school superintendents will just back down. You may not be able to get something that's avowedly secular into a curriculum, but it's a lot easier to get something that's avowedly anti-secular out of a curriculum. 3, I'd like to see more emphasis on certain major political issues on which all secular organizations can agree. I know this sounds like the beginning of a "how many secularists does it take to screw in a light bulb" joke, but I'll give you an example. One of the most glaring omissions throughout this election cycle on the part of candidates from both parties has been any reference to the persecution of freethinkers, not only in Muslim theocracies and in countries torn apart by Muslim and Hindu religious terrorism, but in all kinds of countries such as Bangladesh and Indonesia, which is beginning to go down the road of Bangladesh, where freethinkers are persecuted in the same way, arrested, sometimes tortured, that also Muslims who don't agree with them are persecuted, and Christians are persecuted. Michael Dedora at the Center for Inquiry does nothing else. And this is fine. But I think, for instance, it would have been great in this election to have seen a full-page ad, which I would personally have been happy to contribute to. In a forum that politicians pay attention to, it would probably have to be the Washington Post or the New York Times, signed by every major secular and humanist organization, calling on all candidates to denounce not only the persecution of Christians, but the persecution of freethinkers. Secretary of State Kerry really disappointed me when he made a statement about the radical Muslim persecution of Christians, but never mentioned freethinkers. If Hillary Clinton is elected, I'd like to see a statement published on Inauguration Day and addressed to her personally as the incoming president. I think that would be a very worthwhile expenditure of money on the part of all secular organizations put together. And 4, we need as secular organizations to make constant approaches to politicians who have a secular outlook but are reluctant to say so. I do not think that John Kerry deliberately omitted freethinkers. I think it didn't occur to him because secularists are just so often left out. It used to be the Protestant, Catholic, and Jew litany. Now it's the rabbi, the priest, and the minister, and the imam. Not the secular celebrant. And there are a hell of a lot more secular people in the United States than there are either Muslims or observant Jews, by the way. And if you left an observant Jew or a Muslim off the platform, you would hear from those organizations. Not really. What I really want to see at public events like Newtown is a politician who presents a secular perspective on a public trauma. I don't think it's impossible, but it does require constant lobbying. Look, certainly no one even 10 years ago would think that acknowledgement of gay rights and LGBT rights would become so taken for granted that the phrase itself is in danger of losing some of its force. But it requires more lobbying, more bugging politicians than we already do. And finally, and I'm going to try and wind this up because I do want you to have time for comments and questions. We have to come out and represent ourselves with passion as well as reason and make it so personal. That's one reason why I admire Robert Ingersoll so much. because in fact, who Robert Ingersoll reminded me of with a combination of passion and reason, which he represented in secularism. Robert Ingersoll's speeches and essays reminded me of the kind of passion and reason that Michelle Obama displayed in that speech, which I thought was one of the greatest public speeches I have ever witnessed. The way some secularists present themselves today, Ingersoll presented himself in an essay on, of all things, Tolstoy's novella Kreutzer Sonata. As Ingersoll noted in his essay, music, like sexual passion, generates powerful emotions. And by the time Tolstoy wrote Kreutzer Sonata and had embraced a crazed brand of Christianity, he'd become convinced that emotion is invariably at odds with duty and morality. Tolstoy and other religious ideologues had it exactly backward, Ingersoll argued. Take emotions from the heart of man, he wrote, and the idea of obligation would be lost. Right and wrong would lose their meaning. We are subject to conditions, liable to disease, pain, and death. We are capable of ecstasy. Of these conditions, of these possibilities, the emotions are born. And the generalization of Tolstoy that emotion never goes hand in hand with duty is almost the opposite of truth. The idea of duty could not exist without emotion. Think of men and women without love, without desire, without passions. Think of a world without art or music, a world without beauty, without emotion, unquote. One question I've been asked frequently is how it's possible to get through difficult times in life, and especially the knowledge of death, without belief in a loving supernatural being. It was Susan B. Anthony who played down her non-belief so she wouldn't alienate religious suffragists, who said, if it is true that we die like a flower, leaving behind only a fragrance, what a delusion the race has been in. What a delusion is the life of man. Well, I would say to that leaving a transient scent behind is a lot better than leaving a stench behind. Whether our actions are remembered on a large stage for how long and by whom is not the foundation or the rationale for living what might be called the good lives. The moral rightness or wrongness of our actions can no more be evaluated by how they will be judged in the future by human beings, but by how they will be judged by a God in a supernatural afterlife. Now, those of you who've heard me speak before, and I know quite a few of you have, know that I, like many pre-tweet writers, rarely talk about my personal life. I keep that for my books. However, I'm going to make an exception here because it's so pertinent to the question of why it's important for us to get personal when we talk about our values to others. 8 years ago, my longtime partner died of cancer. He had Alzheimer's disease, but fortunately the cancer killed him before he entered the final stages in which all cognition is destroyed. More than one friend said to me, I don't know how you can get through this without believing in God. Well, I don't know how I would have gotten through it if I did believe in a God who would slowly and methodically destroy a brilliant mind. During the last years of his life, I often wrote him letters because he found it easier to absorb things when they were written down rather than spoken. This isn't true, by the way, of everyone with Alzheimer's, but it was true of him. Here's an excerpt from a letter I wrote him after we'd gone to a movie, as it turned out the last movie he would ever see. And I'm quoting myself now, I saved the letter. Only a few weeks ago, when we saw the movie starting out in the evening, the one starring Frank Langella, I was deeply moved by a line in which he was describing his love for his former wife. She lived in my heart, he said, and I never found that again. Well, you're the only person who's ever really lived in my heart, and that will be true long after you're gone until my last moment of consciousness. We don't believe in life after death, you and I, and we know we're not going to meet someday again in a puffy place with clouds and harps. Although if there were such a place, I would like Harpo Marx playing the harp. Yeah, we have no children together, so the memory of what we've had won't go on in that way either. But I deeply believe that love is never wasted, and whatever good comes from it, we have passed on in some way to others, in everything from books to perhaps a greater tenderness than either of us might have shown without the other. Now we have only moments of time that we have, and we must use them as best we can, unquote. I'm glad I saved a copy of this letter because it brings back all of the conversations we had during those last months. when the light of his mind was dimming but not yet extinguished. I know that the memory of what I was able to do to help him rests only with me, well, a small part of it now with you. But it doesn't matter. It seems to me that the very essence of the atheist and humanist concept of morality is that love is never wasted, even though it's not eternal. Our acts, good and evil, become a part of the world that will continue after us as long as the world continues. There is a grandeur in this view of life, as Darwin said, which truly changed our view of ourselves. But there's also a proportional humility in this perspective. The knowledge that this is our one and only life, a span between unconsciousness that precedes and follows our short existence, lies at the heart of the humanist consciousness. Conveying both the grandeur and the humility of this view of life is the duty of all of us who are not merely sick and tired of God bless America, but who are convinced that rationality is the partner, not the enemy, of private love and public patriotism. Thank you. And now I'll be happy to take questions, and if you want me to get out of your way, I can sit down, okay? Would it be easier for you if I get out of your way? I better stay here. Lady in the back, we'll start from the back.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful.
Speak up.
Thank you so much for that, for all of that. I was wondering, living in New York, how do you feel about what I hear sometimes about vote swapping with other states that might be in a more strategic area? How do you feel about that?
What do you mean vote swapping?
Something about if you're in touch with a person who is in a state that's on the borderline of voting, and they would vote for the person you want. Let's say we would say Hillary, and I might vote for Johnson, let's say, because they really want that, but it's not going to make a difference anyway in New York. So
how I feel about that is that it's idiotic. I really do. And also the thought of I can't think of anybody I could possibly arrange this for. But I really don't think I certainly couldn't live with myself whatever vote swapping I was engaging in if I cast a vote for Gary Johnson. And why Gary Johnson? Why not Trump? Anyway, that's how I feel about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, first of all, I want to apologize for not recognizing you over there when I walked over. But I just want to.
How could anybody not recognize me? I think that's shocking. Shocking. Speak up a little, sir.
I just want to get back to the Ten Commandments thing for a minute, because if you actually read the Ten Commandments, it says clearly, no graven images of anything in the air, the land, or the sea. Now, if you're having a court case with lawyers, they're checking the material. So I'm saying, how can you put a graven image of what's supposed to be the Ten Commandments in a court?
Well, that's an interesting thought. But it's true that a commandments monument might pose some problems. Certainly certain groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, along with Jews and Muslims, in general, that commandment is taken to be a physical representation of a physical person, which is why the radical Islamists get so freaked out by cartoons of Muhammad, who isn't divine, but they treat him as if he were. But that's an interesting point that I've never thought of. But since there's so much in the commandments that nobody thinks about at all.
It just seems like it's a symbol, an emotional symbol, but they don't even know what they don't read.
Well, in any case, Gallup and Pew polls show that the overwhelming majority of Americans can't name the Ten Commandments, either the Catholic version or the Protestant version. Yes, sir.
We might have a sort of power
Speak up, please.
I have a throat problem. We have a power game where we try to guess which American presidents were really atheists. And Obama comes up, JFK, John F. Kennedy. But what do you know about Lincoln? Like, what kind of books did he read?
Oh, well, look, first of all, we know a lot about Lincoln, and I would suggest, since it's still available in paperback, that Freethinker is a history of American secularism. I'm serious. I'm talking about, it has a very concise chapter called The Belief and Unbelief of Abraham Lincoln. I think outright atheists were less common in Lincoln's day and in the 18th century than they were today. I think, probably Thomas Jefferson wouldn't necessarily have called himself an atheist. It had an even worse implication. But what we know about Lincoln is that Thomas Paine was one of his great sources. We know that he had read all of the works of Thomas Paine, which were beginning to enjoy a little revival, although they didn't really get revived till Robert Ingersoll. We know Constantin Volney's The Ruins, which was very popular among freethinkers, and actually it's a terrible book, but we know that. And we know, of course, that Lincoln's favorite writer was Shakespeare, and that Lincoln's writing about Shakespeare saw Shakespeare from a very humanist perspective. We know that Lincoln, even though he was urged by 19 ministers in Springfield during the 1860 campaign, refused to join a church. We don't know if he was an atheist. He wasn't a Christian for sure. He did write to a number of people in personal letters that he did not believe that Jesus was God. But certainly he certainly knew how and when to call on religious symbolism but I don't. In fact, I think Lincoln's second inaugural address is one of the most interesting speeches, because in it he mentions, although the religious right uses it as an example of how he believed in God because he talked about God's justice, but he also pointed out, to me the crucial point, both the North and the South prayed to the same God, and obviously neither of their wishes could be fulfilled. Sir, back in the far back, yeah.
Can you point out any opportunity for us as individuals or as a community to exert pressure on a politician so they seek our support?
Yeah, that's why, well, I'm telling you, that was sort of my idea of the ad. I think, for instance, if there were a full-page ad, it costs a fortune. And I know humanists don't have a lot of money, but the combination of humanists, atheists, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and the Center for Inquiry could certainly afford to buy a full-page ad in the New York Times. I think the slogan they had on the buttons at Freedom from Religion Foundation was, "I'm secular and I vote too." I think an ad aimed at the new incoming president would actually be powerful, and then also, and everybody who signed it then could be calling up and writing. If you think an ad like that isn't noticed by politicians at that level and by their press secretaries, it is. I think that, for instance, the Center for Inquiry, I don't know whether that they didn't, but I think after Kerry did not mention freethinkers in his talk about the persecution of Christians, that any one of the secular groups could have requested a meeting with Kerry's press secretary and pointed this out. I don't think that we've tried enough at this. The Center for Inquiry and the Freedom from Religion Foundation are doing more, but I think that frankly we just have to be knocking on their doors, and I think some kind of a written public announcement would probably be helpful. Not sure, just an idea. Yes, sir.
I just want to make a comment, because when you talk about what to say when someone asks you, if you don't believe in God, why you don't murder all you want.
Now I know what to say. It's only 12 years later.
The magician and well-known atheist Penn Jillette said when someone asked him, if you don't believe in God, why don't you just rape and murder all you want? His reply was, I already rape and murder all I want, which is not at all. And
I never heard that. I already rape and murder all I want. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have another way of answering the question. Whether without God, what stops you from killing and whatever. The decision to be a moral or ethical, honest person is a choice. So if you choose to, whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. It's a choice that you make. And there are plenty of religious people that are murderers.
Well,
what about 9/11?
Of course.
So, I mean, it's an idiotic question. The decision whether you are going to kill or not kill is a decision. Whatever the choice is, you make that choice.
Well, but you know, I mean, I agree, and in fact, but the Inquisition, 9/11 is closer, but I feel that talking about all the bad things religious people do, I feel that's almost like arguing about the existence of God. I can tell you what an evangelical says to you because I've also used that argument. What they say to you is, of course, we're all sinners and we all require grace and forgiveness. That's the essence of evangelical religion, about the personal relationship with God. Well, the answer I would say is yes, we're all sinners, but some of us commit a lot larger sins than others. I mean, it's not like the idea of being a good person is something that just has to do with rape and murder. It's something you do every day. I mean, I think one of the continuing problems with the secular movement is that we are not very charitable in comparison to. We don't give as much to our organizations as religious people give to religion, for instance. That's just a fact. There have been numerous philanthropy surveys done about that. I don't exactly know why that is, but I think another thing we can do, and there are some groups doing it, is when groups give to human rights organizations, general human rights organizations, they can give explicitly as secularists too. Religious people do that. You always know when a Mormon is giving money to some cause. It's given in the name of Mormonism. We don't do that very much. I don't think we actually know what the true dimensions of charitable giving for secularists are. But we certainly, in a way, it's very understandable we don't give as much to organizations because, after all, Richard Dawkins isn't the Pope. Sam Harris isn't the Pope. Annie Laurie Gaylor isn't the Pope. No writer is the Pope. And so that our organizations don't have the same hold over us. And nobody's offering us eternal life either. Very important. Yes, sir.
I've noticed lately a slight bit of progress in politicians, acknowledging that those without religion or without, I forget the phrase that they use. It's a pretty weak one, but it's right. I would say it's the dog.
What they say, those who are not affiliated with any religion, is what they say.
But I think it's the dog whistle to us. So we must be doing something right, and I think it's important. I've never thought about it before this moment, but I think it's important to track down, what it is we're doing that's having some kind of effect, and do more of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, in truth, that's where writers come in. I will tell you, I'm actually working on a piece like that, trying to track that down. I'll tell you, I agree with you that there's been a bit of progress made, but I can tell you, I've spent several weeks trying to track down exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. It is hard. And even people, I do think Obama is very secular, although, by the way, I don't think he's an atheist at all. But even people like Obama, they backslide. Like that thing at Newtown, I really thought, that he failed to give any nod to secular as well as specifically Christian values.
The 9/11 speech also, he started with quoting the scriptures. That was really good.
Yeah, well, you know what? I know that every president, none of us in this room is going to live to see presidents not quoting scriptures any more than Lincoln didn't quote scriptures. But I think that we can live to see they're doing more than a dog whistle. I agree with you, but I will tell you the progress has not been large because I have really been trying to do a piece on this.
I just wanted to add one point. When I have tried to get something done in my neighborhood, and I've directed, remarks to, someone who was running but still in power, and I mentioned, hints, make a very broad hint that I'm not going to vote for them unless they, do something. I get a response.
I think that's right. Just like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which had to sue school administrators in Indiana All they had to do was write a letter to school administrators in Wisconsin that said, oh, no, we're not having any of these people who are promoting religious rallies speaking at our assemblies, and we're going to make sure to check out that none of the people who speak at school, people like school administrators, they're just terrified of controversy. They don't want anybody making trouble for them. That's right. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to go back to our previous discussion about the atheist versus the religionist, and who is the better person. There's been a lot written about this, recently, and that is the atheist who lives a good life and doesn't go into various sins because he truly believes that that's the way to do it and that's the way human beings should act. Whereas the person who is a religionist doesn't do those evil things because he's afraid of going to hell if he does it. Who's the better person?
Well,
no, even more than that. Giuliani recently said, when he was questioned about his infidelity,
adultery is part of the middle-class American way of life.
He said, I confess to my priest. So,
confession is since I was raised a Catholic, confession is of course one of the great appeals of Catholicism. But who's the whole question of who is the better person? The atheist who either refrains from evil or does good because they're convinced that's the right thing to do, or the religious person who does it for fear of hell. I don't think that all religious people who are good people behave that way because they're afraid of hell. I think, I don't know whether Jimmy Carter believes in hell, but I don't think that he's lived the life he's lived and done the work he's done with his foundation since he was president because he's afraid of hell. And I don't think it matters a damn whether he's a Baptist or an atheist, which of course he's not. Look, being good is hard no matter what your beliefs are. I mean, it's not like somebody's making a decision to be good. But who does that? It's like temptation of one kind or another comes at you all the time. It never stops. It's not like I love the idea, by the way. I hate all these stories about how older people are wiser than younger people and all that kind of thing. I think on the contrary, I think if you were a real son of a bitch when you were 40, you're going to be even worse when you're 80. I think one of the things that age does is it accentuates what you were all along, because you don't have as much scope. I mean, look at the ridiculous things that old people who are bad people claim. My literary agent, who is in his 80s and is incredibly strong and young for somebody in his 80s, works out at the gym every day with people who are younger than he is. And he pointed out something to me, which is that Donald Trump, when he allegedly made these locker room remarks that were taped, was 59. And as George said, he said, what I overhear in the locker room with people who are in their 50s and 60s is talking about their latest doctor's appointment, their latest test, their latest new medicine or whatever. He said, somebody who's 59 who's still talking about somebody who's 13. I'll tell you something else. At the Freedom from Religion Foundation, speaking about goodness and motives for it, I gave my speech in the late afternoon, which bore some resemblance to this speech, although events have required an update in this speech. But last Saturday was the day that tape first came out. So, of course, everybody was very excited at the Freedom from Religion Foundation convention. After my speech, I went down to the hotel bar to have a drink, and it was in Pittsburgh. And there was a young guy next to me. He was 28, as it turned out. And he was a junior executive at Heinz, which is a very big deal in Pittsburgh. Now that steel is gone, Heinz ketchup was their biggest single industry. And anyway, in this bar, instead of having sports on the TV, they had the endless number of news things coming out, including Donald Trump's original interview in which he said, "That's just locker room talk." And this guy just put his head in his hands, and we started talking. And he said he was there in the hotel because his job is servicing clients who are fans of Heinz's sugar-free organic ketchup line, which is sold on both coasts and of all places in Italy, which I was quite fascinated to learn. You learn a lot traveling. And he said if somebody like that, he had in fact taken several executives and his client to play golf that day. It was a very warm day in the high 70s in Pittsburgh. And he said if anybody were saying any stuff like that, he said they would have no future in the company. And as far as doing business with them, you would really think twice about it. But he said also, he was a very nice young man. And he said also, look, he said the thing that worries me about this is, he said, I can imagine something like this, not as explicit, in the locker room when I was 13 or 14, before any of us had ever actually had the opportunity to kiss a woman on the lips, before they really had been able to do anything, just sort of imagining what they might do on that wonderful day when they actually were able to consensually put their hands on a girl. But he said, when I think about it, once you get just a little older and you actually are going out with girls, you stop doing that. And he said, I know when I go home tonight, my girlfriend is going to ask me this locker room question. And he said, I'll bet you that women all over America are going to be asking guys that locker room question. And he said, honestly, that is not the way grown men talk. And he said, what I would think of a guy who talked like that was that he sounded like a 13 or a 14-year-old, which is not really somebody you do business with. I absolutely believed him about that. And I'll bet, again, that's something Michelle Obama really hit in her talk about how insulting it really is to men.
And he didn't say it in a locker room.
And
He was at work in the truck.
That's true. But probably the whole world is a locker room to him. Okay.
Thank you, Susan, for a wonderful talk.
Really.
And I was particularly touched by the letter you shared with us, which I thought was just a lovely, wonderful thing to do. And I'm reminded of back when the Gates was in New York. Quiet! Christo and Jean-Claude did. The late Jean-Claude.
Louder, please.
I asked her a question. I said, why is it that you two artists do not work in a conventional way, in stone or wood or in some ways that are more, in paint, that are more permanent? Everything you do is temporary. And she almost teared up. She said, all the things in life that we most treasure are ephemeral. Childhood, love, life, and so on.
I'm glad childhood was ephemeral. As far as I'm concerned, childhood is something worth getting over. Okay, thank you very much.